The Where Our Minds Wander podcast may contain sensitive content and explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Greetings, fellow wanderers, to the places our minds wander.
The house at the end of the dirt road, where disembodied voices whisper and strange sounds make the living shiver.
Where shadows lurk at the edge of the woods, just outside your back door. And mysterious lights speed beyond reason across the clear night sky.
Odd events throughout time that lead you down the rabbit hole.
I'm Wes.
And I'm Beth.
And this is Where Our Minds Wander. Hello and welcome to Where Our Minds Wander, all you fellow wanderers. Thank you for joining us. We're so glad to have so many return listeners and new ones joining the Wanders family every day. We appreciate each and every one of you.
We really do. Thank you. You know, I can't believe how fast this month has just flown by. Like, it just flew by, and we're already on the brink of December.
Yeah, I know. It did go by really fast. And we did get our November bonus episode out about a week ago. So if you haven't checked it out, please do that.
Yeah, and if you're starting your holiday shopping, although we just started thinking about it today, holiday shopping.
Right, yes.
But why not stop by our merch store in TeePublic if you're online and check out all the cool gift options that we have. You could always buy something for yourself, too, or tell a friend or a family member about the cool stuff that we have for sale.
Yeah, and if you haven't already, go ahead and check out our website. There is a link to our TeePublic store there and a link to our Amazon Kindle Direct store, which has our book, 13 Creepy Urban Legend Stories, and the young adult sci-fi novel that Beth wrote, Project Earth.
Yeah, so if you want to check out our books or the TeePublic store, the best way to find them, like Wes said, is to go to our website, which is simply whereourmindswander.com.
It's pretty simple. I just checked it out the other day. I like going looking at it. I know. It's pretty bad when you
check out your own stuff.
Check out your own stuff.
Well, you do want to make sure that, things are up to date and that the new stuff that we've created is there and all that kind of stuff.
And everything's running right.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's about enough of housekeeping. Beth, why don't you let everyone know what we're talking about tonight?
Okay, well, for tonight's episode, it's another case where there was so much information that we decided that we'd dedicate the entire episode to this one topic, and we'll just tag team it.
Yeah. In a nutshell, we're talking about doppelgangers and how romantic writers Percy and Mary Shelley were terrorized by one.
So you make it sound so happy.
Well, it's so interesting.
It is really interesting.
I'm just full of excitement.
I am too. It's a cool topic. I hope everybody enjoys it. So, when it comes to romantic writers, Percy Bysshe and Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, I think a lot of people already know the story of how Frankenstein was born. But in a nutshell, it was 1816 and the couple were vacationing in Geneva with Mary's stepsister Claire Clairmont and writers John Polidori and Lord Byron. The weather was horrible, and after days of being stuck inside, amusing themselves by making up ghost stories, Lord Byron suggested they all compete in a story writing contest to see who could pen the scariest of scary stories. Mary Shelley, at just 18, won. It took 2 years and a pen name for Frankenstein to be published, but if it weren't for that rainy holiday, who knows if it would have ever been written. Like I said, that story is pretty well known. But what I didn't know is that Percy and Mary weren't married yet during that Geneva trip. Well, Percy was married, just not to Mary. And Percy Shelley was seeing his own doppelganger.
That he did, and also various famous people have seen their own doppelgangers throughout history, some with disastrous consequences, which seems to be the case with Percy Shelley. It's not unheard of for everyday people to come across their own doppelgangers. It seems to happen a lot in airports, sports venues, and hospitals. It can be totally unnerving to see someone who looks just like you, and, depending on what you believe, it can be completely cool, or it can mean that you're going to die.
Which is why I thought it was funny that you sounded so happy when we were starting the episode. But anyway, continue.
All you have to do is look at the internet to see celebrity lookalikes, or everyday people who have taken photos with their supposed doubles, who are in no way related.
You know, it's kind of weird, but I had my own doppelganger experience a couple decades ago. So every time I'd go to our local mall, I'd see this colleague of mine. And, you know, I'd say hi as we passed each other. And this woman would just look at me like she thought I was like nutballs or something. She always just kind of looked at me funny. And then I'd go to work and I'd ask my colleague, why'd you look at me funny at the mall? And she'd say, well, I wasn't at the mall. So finally, like the fourth or fifth time that I saw this woman at the mall, I said hello to her again, but I called her by name. And this woman was like, my name isn't Heather. It's whatever. I don't remember what her name was. But she was like really annoyed with me. So I told her that she looked just like a colleague of mine, and she got even more annoyed. And she was like, well, that's not me. My name is whatever, Susie or whatever it was. So I went back to work the following week and saw my colleague, and I was like, you know, I think you have a twin. And she goes, yeah, I've heard about her. Apparently we look a lot alike. And I wanted to say, yeah, well, she's not very friendly. You're a doppelganger.
Right. Well, maybe you two could have got together, went to the mall, and see if you could have seen this doppelganger together.
I know. It was a very weird experience. And I was surprised by how angry this other woman got that I, said she looked like somebody. But anyway, it was a while ago and it was very strange.
It happens. Something similar happened to me when I was in high school. Two of my buddies came up to me after lunch period and asked me why I ignored them when they tried to talk to me Saturday night downtown outside a local bar. And I was like, I wasn't downtown Saturday night. And they insisted it was me and that I completely ignored them. I tried to convince them, but they just wouldn't believe me.
It's very strange.
I was like adamant about it. Look, it's not me. They just thought I totally shunned them.
Huh.
And why? I've never done that before to anybody. Why would I do it then?
And you're very distinctive in our area. You look very different, dapper and handsome compared to, well, I shouldn't say that. Any
Stop
local listeners
sucking up to me.
I'm thinking any local listeners are going to be like, hey, what is she saying about the men in this town? All I'm saying is you have a very distinct look, so it would be difficult to confuse you with someone else. And you're tall.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. Anyway, back to Percy Shelley. Apparently, Percy was into the macabre and the supernatural from a very young age. He and his younger sisters would dress up in all kinds of costumes to try and look like ghosts or demons. He was known to pour some sort of flammable liquid into the stove to try and create the flames of hell. And he also tried his best to scare the heck out of his sisters with ghost stories he came up with himself. He liked to doodle little drawings of demons and fiends in the margins of his books. This was all before the age of 10. In 1804, at age 16, Percy attended Eton College. He got into trouble for a bunch of things like electroshocking a professor and blowing up a tree stump with gunpowder. He also got into trouble for attempting to summon demons by standing in the middle of a circle made of blue flames.
Geez, he was the guy to know.
I know, he sounds like he'd be fun to hang out with, doesn't he?
He does. For us, he would be fun to hang out with.
Yeah. Now, he would go for walks by himself at midnight, and when he did sleep, he had horrible nightmares, or he would be discovered sleepwalking the grounds. His friends received letters from him saying all kinds of disturbing things. For example, he wrote to a friend that he was sure he'd meet, quote, death, demons, and skeletons, dripping with the putrefaction of the grave while traveling over a holiday. Or his fear that, quote, at the frightful hour of midnight, he'd awake to see the hell demon leaning over his sleeping form.
Jeez.
I know. That is creepy as all hell.
It is creepy.
One of his friends, Thomas Jefferson Hogg, recalled Percy telling him that during his midnight walks, he could hear the devil following him. Piers began referring to Percy as Mad Shelley.
It's like Spooky Mulder.
It is like Spooky Mulder. To combat his nervous attacks and sleepwalking, Percy took copious amounts of laudanum. Later on, he may have also contracted tuberculosis at some point, which may have contributed to his hallucinations. But in 1813, things really started to turn strange.
At the time, Percy was still married to his first wife, Harriet. They had gone to South Wales to set up a home for themselves. But before long, Percy had somehow managed to piss off a bunch of his neighbors. Maybe he was setting up circles of blue flames out in the fields.
Maybe so.
But fearing revenge, he convinced himself that one of his neighbors, Robert Leeson, was trying to kill him. During a storm on the night of February 26th, several gunshots rang out. Although no one saw any intruders, Percy swore that Leeson had entered the house to assassinate him. Even though Harriet and Percy's friends calmed him down, he claimed Leeson came back later that same night and tried to kill him again. Since no one else heard or saw anything, they began chiding Percy for being afraid of a phantom attacker and referred to the incident as Shelley's ghost. But Percy was adamant that Leeson was out to kill him, and he even insisted he saw the man in London and in Italy in later months.
In his journals, Percy began writing about himself, referring to his doubleness as if there were two Percys. One, a normal writer who had friendships and laughter. The other, an anti-self that was much, much darker in nature. So, of course, there's some evidence that Percy Shelley's nervous attacks, sleepwalking, laudanum use, and fear of the dark entities, or another him, were really symptoms of mental health issues that no one would have diagnosed at that time. In May of 1814, at the age of 22, Percy was kicked out of Oxford for some pamphlets that he had published that were considered too radical. He then met 16-year-old Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin. They would often walk through cemeteries together and visit Mary's mother's grave. Allegedly, they declared their love for each other at her gravesite. The only problem was that Percy was already married.
And the thing is, marriage didn't seem to mean a lot to Percy. He and Mary had a circle of friends, including Mary's stepsister Claire, Lord Byron, John Polidori, and Percy's friend Thomas Jefferson Hogg, and they all kind of swapped beds whenever the urge overtook them.
Oh, wow. They were early swingers, weren't they?
Yeah.
Well, teach their own. Percy and Mary pretty much flaunted their affair too, traveling all over Europe with their band of friends. It was during this time that Lord Byron proposed the writing contest that resulted in Frankenstein, and this is when Mary lost her first child. In December of 1816, Harriet Shelley, Percy's wife, drowned herself at the age of 21. She was pregnant with her second child at that time. 2 weeks after her death, Percy and Mary were married.
Quick turnaround.
Very quick.
So Mary loses a child that was Percy's, and then his wife had been pregnant with a child. Yeah. So he got around, and I think he left a lot of female casualties of broken hearts.
Well, that wasn't just back then. That happens today also.
Well, I know.
And there's pretty quick turnaround for some people.
There can be.
It's like, I love you to death. And then, a couple weeks later, well, I love you. They've met someone new.
Right. It's their soulmate.
Yeah.
Yeah. In 1822, Mary's stepsister Claire lost her 5-year-old daughter Allegra from an illness. The child's father was Lord Byron, and he had hidden Allegra away in a convent to be raised by nuns. To help her process through her grief, Mary and Percy invited Claire to join them in Italy, where they had rented a house in Lerici a few months earlier. Percy's friends Jane and Edward Williams and Edward Trelawney came too. Soon after arriving in Lerici, Mary realized she was pregnant for the 5th time. Between 1814 and 1822, 3 of Percy's and Mary's 4 children had died. This time, Mary was understandably worried about this pregnancy, and she hated the house in Lerici. Percy reportedly loved the wildness of Lerici, but within a week, he was seeing his demons once again. He told Edward Williams that he watched a child emerge from the sea. Then one day, while the 2 men were out on the terrace, Percy began shouting. The child had reappeared. Couldn't Edward Williams see it? It was emerging from the sea, its hands clasped together, its face beaming with joy. There was no child. And then the doppelganger appeared.
At first, Percy claimed that he caught sight of a man who looked just like him out on the terrace in broad daylight. The man spoke to him, asking, "How long do you mean to be content?" Then, not long after, Jane Williams saw the doppelganger also. She was standing at a window in the middle of the day, looking down at the terrace, when she clearly saw Percy walk by. Seconds later, she saw him pass by again, walking in the same direction as seconds before. Mary said later that Jane was not a nervous person, nor very imaginative, and that the 2 of them could not figure out how Percy had walked by twice in the same direction without jumping over the terrace wall to the ground 20 feet below, and then circling the house and reappearing seconds later. The very next day, Mary collapsed and miscarried her child. There was no doctor around to help, and in a panic, Percy made her submerge in an ice bath for 8 hours to stop the bleeding, which nearly killed her as well.
And what I found creepy is that his doppelganger had supposedly asked him, "How long do you mean to be content?" And then all these horrible things start happening.
I know.
It's downright chilling. And who needs Frankenstein when such classic Gothic horrors are happening to the Shelleys in their real lives?
Well, it sounds like they could be manifesting this themselves.
I think there could be a very strong argument that Percy Shelley was manifesting it himself.
A week later, the entire party, Claire, Trelawney, and the Williamses, woke up in the middle of the night to ungodly screaming coming from Mary's room. She had been behaving both incredibly angry and cold towards her husband since the miscarriage, and they rushed in fearing the worst. They found Percy in a state of complete hysterics, saying he had had a horrible vision. First, he had seen the house flooded by the sea and both Jane and Edward Williams covered in blood. Then, the vision had shifted to a man bent over Mary in bed, choking the life out of her. The man had turned his head, and Percy was horrified to see his own face staring back at him. Now, maybe what Percy and Mary needed was some time apart, perhaps.
So Percy and Edward Williams boarded Percy's boat, the Don Juan, on July 1st. Percy had recently modified the Don Juan with additional topmasts and sails because he liked to race Lord Byron and he wanted to win their next race. But for now, the two men were simply planning to sail along the coast to Livorno. They stayed a week. Despite warnings of bad weather, on July 8, 1822, Percy insisted that he and Williams needed to return to the house in Lerici. He hired an 18-year-old boat boy, Charles Vivian, to go with them. The combination of bad weather and additional sails were disastrous. Another ship came upon them and begged Shelley to abandon ship and get on board. He refused. The captain told them that at the very least they should lower their sails. Percy physically stopped Williams from doing so. 10 days later, the bodies of all three men washed ashore near Viareggio. Percy's face and hands were so badly eaten away that they could only identify him by his clothes and a volume of poetry he had in his pocket.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah. They were buried immediately in the sand. It was a month later when Percy was exhumed and allowed to be cremated on a pyre right there on the beach. Lord Byron and Edward Trelawney were present. After the cremation, they discovered something quite grisly: Percy's heart. It had not burned. And in a true Gothic fashion, Mary Shelley requested that it be given to her. She wrapped it in the pages of his poetry and kept it in her writing desk for the rest of her life.
Oh my God, can you imagine? Is that really true?
It's 100% true. Although experts now think that it was actually his liver, not his heart, and that it had calcified due to complications from tuberculosis. But it's 100% true that she kept one of his organs wrapped in his poetry in her desk.
Yeah, what does it matter if it's a heart or a liver? It's a human organ.
I know.
That you keep in your desk.
I know. They were the epitome, they were the definition of Gothic horror story.
So, what exactly was going on with Percy Shelley and his doppelganger? Was Percy just suffering from mental health issues? Or are there really doppelgangers out there? We'll get into all that after a quick break.
Hey, did you know? Clouds are not the light and fluffy objects they appear to be. In fact, a single cloud can weigh a whopping 1.1 million pounds. How do we know this? Because experts can simply take the water density of a cloud and multiply it by its volume. So, how do they float across the sky instead of crushing us all? Because the weight of the air beneath the clouds is even heavier. How's that for a mind bend? I mean, who'da thunk it?
All right, we're back, and we're ready to tackle the question of whether people who see doppelgangers are experiencing some sort of temporary mental health issue or if doppelgangers are indeed real.
On one hand, the answer could be entirely mental health related, or more specifically, brain mechanics malfunctioning. There are actually 3 types of doppelganger phenomenon, or autoscopy, if you want to use the technical term. And I think it's autoscopy. It could be autoscopy.
I'm not quite sure. I haven't heard of that in my medical experience.
I know, I didn't look it up either, and I usually do look up these things. I was slacking, apparently, on the pronunciation of A-U-T-O-C. No, I can't even spell it. Wow.
I know.
Can we just edit all that out so people don't know how dumb I am sometimes?
Nope, we're leaving it in.
It's A-U-T-O-S-C-O-P-Y. So auto means self, of course, and scopio or scopio means looking at. Oh, scope, like telescope, looking at. So otoscopy.
Right. Well, it happens. But, you're one of the most well-read and well-traveled people that I've ever met in my life.
Well, I still don't know how to pronounce this word,
No.
otoscopy. Anyway.
You want to be me?
We've had this conversation before. If we could, yeah. Anyway, the first form of otoscopy, according to a BBC article, is when someone feels as if there is another presence in a room, even though there's no one else there. The second form is when you actually hallucinate and see yourself. The third form is the classic out-of-body experience. Now, see, I didn't know that those were related, that doppelgangers and OBEs were part of the same phenomenon. But now that I know that, it makes a lot of sense.
That it does.
All three, according to the article, are caused by malfunctions in the part of the brain that roots us in the here and now. And that part of the brain is called the right angular gyrus. The angular gyrus is near the vestibular cortex, which regulates our posture and sense of balance. Several studies have shown that when you mess with the right angular gyrus, you can cause people to feel and see all kinds of things. 20 years ago, a young man in Zurich had experienced something pretty terrifying. Suffering from seizures, he had stopped taking his anticonvulsant medication one day and spent the day drinking instead. He was laying in bed for most of the day as he drank, but at one point, when he stood up, he found himself staring at himself still in bed. Angry that he was going to be late for work, the man shook his doppelganger. He even shoved him and jumped on him. Throughout the interaction, the young man slipped back and forth between both beings, himself and his perceived doppelganger. One moment he was in his body, shoving the prone doppelganger in his bed, and the next moment he was in the bed watching his doppelganger bend over him, shoving him in anger.
Can you imagine? That had to be terrifying.
I know. Thoroughly confused and questioning just which being was actually himself, the young man jumped from his 4-story window. Thankfully, his fall was broken by some bushes, and he lived to tell his story to neuropsychology PhD candidate Peter Brugger at the University Hospital Zurich. Brugger counseled the young man, and after surgery to remove a brain tumor, both the seizures and the doppelganger out-of-body experiences stopped.
In 2002, neurologist Olaf Blanc at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology was working with a 43-year-old female epilepsy patient. Up to that point, no medication seemed to lessen her seizures. She agreed to surgery and to having electrodes placed directly on her brain. By stimulating the right angular gyrus, Blanc noticed some pretty interesting results. The woman first said she felt her body sinking into the bed. Then she said she felt like she was falling from a great height. When they upped the charge to the electrode, she said she was now floating above her body and could see herself lying on the bed below. Curious, Blanc wanted to see if stimulating the right angular gyrus made people without epilepsy see their doppelgangers or have an out-of-body experience. In 2005, he and philosopher Thomas Metzinger and student Binga Legenhager conducted a series of experiments where they had participants sit in a room one at a time while being filmed. The participants wore headgear that showed them the real-time recordings of themselves sitting in the room. The headgear made it seem as though their double was sitting about 7 feet in front of them. Then, one of the team would take a stick and run it across or down the participant's back. They'd feel it, but they'd also see it happening to their double sitting 7 feet away from them. Time after time, several participants swore that not only could they feel the touch on their back, but they could feel it on their doppelganger's back too.
That's so creepy. And we've seen those experiments too, where like they put a divider in between and they give somebody a fake rubber arm.
Yes.
And then they do the things where they pretend to take like a hammer to it, and people like freak out because they think their real arm is going to be hit with the hammer. I mean,
yes,
it's amazing what our brains can do.
And if you haven't seen anything like that, you can check that out online also. So maybe that's one explanation for Percy Shelley's doppelganger. Maybe his right angular gyrus was being stimulated in some way that it was causing him to hallucinate. Or maybe it was something even more simple, like the laudanum he relied on to make it throughout the day.
But what about that woman I kept seeing in the mall who I kept mistaking for my colleague? Or your friends that claimed that they saw you downtown and insisted that it was really you? There's hundreds of photos online of people with their doppelgangers. Are those all fake? Well, actually, they're not. Because on the flip side, the side where the doppelganger phenomenon is not a problem with brain function, people really do have twins who are in no way related to them.
That they do.
Canadian artist Francois Brunel has been photographing non-related twins for years. He said in a Wired article that sometimes he has to pose them just right and with just the right lighting to get a shot where they look identical. But he finds it fascinating that some humans look so very much alike.
Well, I can see that happening across the world. But what's the chance of it happening right here in your own community?
And that's what does happen, is that these people live in the same cities. Like they didn't grow up in that particular area. They move there and then find somebody that looks just like them that also moved there from somewhere else. Researchers Dr. Manel Estelar and Carlos Garcia Prieto found it pretty fascinating too. They analyzed the DNA of 16 pairs of unrelated twins featured in Brunel's book. They discovered that the DNA of those 16 pairs were extremely similar. For example, the genetic sites or gene groups that determine lip, eye, nose, and skull shape were nearly identical. Even the genetic sites for skin texture were almost identical. The team also ran the faces of all 16 pairs through face recognition software. Half of the 16 pairs came back as identified by the program as identical twins.
Boy, you better hope your doppelganger out there or your twin lookalike is, on the up and up.
I was going to say, not my evil twin.
Right.
Lastly, they had each pair fill out questionnaires about themselves and their daily lives, and they found similarities there too. For example, smoking habits were strikingly similar in each pair, and so was their educational level.
But that's not all. They also discovered that in the pairs that the facial recognition software said were identical twins, their microbiomes were also eerily similar. A microbiome is the collection of microorganisms, viruses, bacteria, and fungi that live on us. So not only was their DNA similar, but their microorganisms were too, despite what part of the world they lived in. What struck some of the pairs themselves as eerie was that a few of them actually lived in the same city, having moved there from other places. So according to the study, it is 100% possible to have a doppelganger out there somewhere.
So what does it all mean? Well, who knows? Countless TV shows, books, and movies have tried to answer that question. Percy Shelley tried to answer that question, and unfortunately, it took such a mental toll on him that he suffered greatly for it. I think the best way to think about it is to not think about it at all.
Oh, bury your head in the sand?
Oh, yeah.
Pretend it doesn't exist?
Yes. And if you do run into your doppelganger one day, don't run away. Take a picture, put it on social media, and enjoy the fact that our universe is a very, very strange place.
I'm going to invite my doppelganger over.
Of course you are. You've been talking about wanting to clone yourself for a very long time, so this would be a much easier solution.
You know, I just find it all interesting. And that's what I love about it all. That's what makes the world go round. That's what keeps you getting up every day, besides the job and having to make money and all that other crap.
The idea of doppelgangers out there?
Just the cool stuff that's out there.
Yeah.
Makes your mind wander all the time.
I know. And I did learn a lot, I'm sure you did too, about Percy and Mary Shelley. And it's really a sad story.
Oh, that it is.
You know, I mean, the poor man was pretty much tortured, and she was too.
Well, I had heard the story before, but I didn't know all this.
Right.
Well, that about wraps it up for this episode, all you fellow wanderers.
Yeah, and as always, if you want to do some research on your own, you could always check out our sources in our show notes for a jumping off point. And it's a good way for you to follow us down the rabbit hole even deeper.
And like we said before, we greatly appreciate each and every one of you. And thank you for joining us. And with that said, join us again next week for all new episode of Where Our Minds Wander.
See you soon.